Theo, who you'll hear from a little bit later, and I are really excited to be sharing this work in this forum because it is entirely based on open data, much of it from the state, actually, and the federal government. But we've really started this work with a focus on New York City, and so that's where we'll start, and are excited to share it with you. As I go, we will have a section at the end for questions and discussion suggestions, but do feel free to put something in the chat or raise your hand to make a comment or ask a question as we're going. And so this work is about a new tool called Integrate USA, but I want to give a little bit of background before I do on sort of how we got to this point. This work grew out of work with the New York State Education Department and Columbia's Center for Public Research and Leadership. I see Kimberly Austin here from CPRL, who was instrumental, along with others, in that project to develop a measure of segregation that the state could use initially to identify districts that were segregated so the state could give grants to these districts to develop policies to promote integration. There are a number of districts that received grants through this program. Two of them were Manhattan's District 3 and Brooklyn's District 15. And those two districts, the second of which, District 15, worked with WXY. I see a couple of WXY staff members here in the meeting, worked with WXY and the local community district to develop integration plans for their middle schools. These were for fifth graders going into sixth grade, and both in the same year, in 2019-20. With some co-authors, we did some research that showed that District 15's plan had a pretty big impact. In the first year, economic segregation went down by 55%, and racial segregation declined by 38%. District 3 also saw declines, though they were very small and not statistically significant. So what we want to do today is first update that research. It's actually been 4 years since that research came out, so we want to provide an update through the current school year, and this will be using data from New York State through our existing tool, integrateny.org, to analyze and update District 15 research. We then want to spend some time introducing and demonstrating Integrate USA, which is a national tool to do some of the same work on measuring and tracking school demographics and school segregation. Theo will talk a bit about the technology behind Integrate USA. Theo was instrumental in all different aspects of actually building the project, and talk about what we learned and how it varies from Integrate NY. And then we'll get feedback and respond to questions. But I also do want to thank, in particular, the Carnegie Corporation of New York for funding this work, as well as the New York State Education Department and New York Community Trust, who funded some of the earlier Integrate NY work. So to give some background, New York State has a very diverse public school system. This is a picture looking over time, over the last 45 years, of racial demographics of the New York City public school system. And we see that the state is diverse and has become more diverse over time. In fact, if we look at New York State right here, compared to all other states in the country, by some measures, New York is actually one of the most diverse states. By this measure, the second most diverse state in the country. We're looking here at the diversity index. It asks the question, if I randomly take two students, what is the chance that they are of a different race or ethnicity? For New York State, that's 72%. There's a relatively high chance that two randomly selected students are of a different race or ethnicity. That is much lower for some districts that have a much higher proportion of one race, often white students, than others. New York State, remember, has 40% 40% of the students in New York State public schools are white. So while the state as a whole is relatively diverse, it is also segregated. And so if we look at the state's schools, there's about 4,600 public schools in New York. Very few of them have 40% white students, or really anything close to 40% white students. Most schools have either very few white students, so 0 to 10%. In fact, over 700 have between 0 and 2% white students, or a large number of white students, 80 or 90% or more on the right-hand side of this histogram. So New York State is very diverse, but segregated. Some of that segregation, in fact, a substantial amount, happens between districts. So what we're looking at here is a map of Monroe County. Monroe is in the northwestern part of the state, and includes the city of Rochester. And we're looking at the racial demographics of the public schools in Monroe County. And we can see that the city of Rochester in the middle has a very different demographic profile or racial demographic profile than the surrounding school districts elsewhere in the county. So particularly outside New York City, there's a lot of between district segregation. But inside New York City, there is a substantial amount of within district segregation. And we can see that looking at one of the districts that we're going to study, District 15, which makes up a part of Brooklyn, including Park Slope, Windsor Terrace, Red Hook, and other neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And we see here looking at economic segregation as opposed to racial segregation, but looking at economic segregation, we're looking at the percent of each school that is economically disadvantaged in the 6th grade in 2018-19. And the reason we picked that is it is right before the integration plan that I mentioned earlier. So we can see, for example, the first school on the list, MS 442, has 23% of students who are economically disadvantaged, whereas the schools lower on the list have 94 and 95% of students who are economically disadvantaged. And we can see that there is a wide distribution around the district average of 55.9% economically disadvantaged. And so for Integrate NY, the existing state-specific website, we look at something we call the Economic Segregation Index, which essentially calculates how different is each school from the state average. On this measure, like percent economically disadvantaged, we'd see the first school is 32.5 percentage points away from the district average. Schools near the middle are fairly close to the district average, and the school at the bottom is 39.2 percentage points away from the district average. And so again, this is the measure we have used, and we could say that in District 15, if we take a weighted average, weighted by the enrollment of each school, the typical school has a 6th grade class that is 23.4 percentage points away from the district average in terms of percent economically disadvantaged. Is that a lot or a little? Well, we can look at other districts in New York City. New York City is made up of 32 community school districts. And if we look at the exact same calculation for the 6th grade class in 2018-19 for economic segregation, we see that New York City was in fact the second highest. Only District 3, another district that we studied, was higher, and most of the districts had a lower segregation number. Now, District 15, as I mentioned, developed a diversity plan, and that plan essentially, that plan was very comprehensive and very thorough, but some of the major components that we end up studying are the changes to the admission system. Which fundamentally boiled down to a controlled choice program that changed the matching process for 6th graders in 2 key ways. One is a proportion of seats, 52% of seats were prioritized for low-income students or students who were English language learners or living in temporary housing. So there was a priority for seats for rising 6th graders, and academic screens were removed. Historically, most of the middle schools had screened students based on test scores, grades, attendance, or other factors, and that was removed and students were admitted by lottery. So what we studied is what happened to the economic segregation index. As we saw before, that number was 23.4. I showed you how it was calculated looking at all the sixth grade class of all the middle schools. And if we go back in time, we see that that number had been fairly consistent over the previous years. We see it, bumping up and down a little bit based on different entering classes, different measurements, but had generally been between 20 and 30, sort of in the mid-20s for the prior years. What we found when looking at the first year of the integration plan was a 55% decrease in economic segregation, a much more even distribution by students' economic status among sixth graders. Now, as I mentioned, we wrote up with co-authors. We wrote this up in an academic paper. Ended up last year getting published in Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis. But in the meantime, there was a lot of back and forth with reviewers, as any of you who are academics know, and some of their main concerns centered around the time frame. At the time we were writing the paper, we had 1 year of data, and reviewers were concerned about how sustainable the policy would be, what would be the effect in future years. And so we now have 4 more years of data since our original analysis. And so the next few slides essentially update the results to see what has happened as far as segregation in District 15. And the short answer is it's increased a bit, but not all the way back to where it was. So we see that the economic segregation index, which had gone down from 23 to 10, has gone back up over the years and is now about 37% below pre-plan level, but not as low as it was in year one. So there's been some resegregation by economic status in District 15, though it continues to be well below where segregation was before. It's worth remembering that these were an unusual 4 years, as you all probably know. COVID happened midway through the first year of the plan. So there obviously is a lot going on, but that also has happened in all other grades and all other schools. If we look, for example, at other grades in District 15, which is one of the features that we try to focus on in both Integrate NY and Integrate USA, the ability to make comparisons, we see that while in sixth grade there was a quick drop in segregation, in eighth grade, essentially the same kids 2 years later, there was no change in the first 2 years. And then 2 years later, when those sixth graders aged up into eighth graders, there was a substantial drop in economic segregation. Fifth grade, which had historically been roughly similar to sixth and eighth grade in terms of segregation, though a little bit higher at the time of the plan's implementation, has just continued along as always. There's been no integration plan, at least not one that I know of, and sixth grade segregation has continued to be, fifth grade segregation has continued to be high. We can also compare to other districts, and this is something we do quite extensively and in many different ways in the prior research. Here we're looking at New York State data again, and we're looking at those districts that have more than 1,000 sixth graders, a percent economically disadvantaged within 25 percentage points of District 15, and economic segregation in the planned year within 10 percentage points of District 15. And we end up with Buffalo and a number of districts in New York City, like District 2, District 13, District 31, which is Staten Island. And what we see is, compared to these other districts, it looks like this decline was a pretty substantial decline in segregation. And we see most of the other districts seem to be fairly steady, though there are sometimes jumps and dips in their segregation numbers. Though we also see none of these is really a perfect comparison for District 15. In fact, most of them were somewhat far from District 15 to begin with. And that really creates one of the motivations for Integrate USA, finding more comparison districts across the country. If we look at racial segregation, which ends up being an important characteristic of segregation, though not the focus of the District 15 plan, because of legal limitations of focusing on racial segregation, we do see a drop in racial segregation, as I mentioned before, of 38%. And we also see there has been a gradual resegregating of the district, though not to the level that the district was before in terms of segregation. So racial segregation remains 13% below pre-plan levels, not as far below as economic segregation, which continues to be the focus of the plan and of the admissions mechanism. Another question that we got from reviewers, and I think of general interest, is has there been any change in the demographics of the district over the last 5 years subsequent to the integration plan? We see before the diversity plan, the district was a racially diverse district, had been growing somewhat more so in the years leading up to the plan. And the demographics, we're looking here at sixth grade, have stayed almost the same. There has been very little change in the proportion of students in each racial or ethnic group. And the same holds true for economic status, though it's not shown here. It has been fairly consistent. So there has not been a dramatic change in demographics. Overall, I'd say District 15 continues to be a success story as far as an integration policy, tempered by the fact that we do see there has been, over time, some resegregation of the district. So the dramatic results we saw in the first year have not quite held up over time. There's been very little demographic change over time in terms of the mix of students in the district. And comparing to other New York State districts is helpful, but it's limited by the fact that really it's hard to find other districts that look very similar to District 15. And so that really creates one of the motivations for our project for Integrate USA, which is a new national tool to measure segregation. One of the motivations, as I said, is to find better comparison districts to evaluate integration initiatives in New York, which we're very familiar with. But there are many other integration initiatives elsewhere. In one accounting I saw, there were over 100 different school districts or states implementing some type of integration initiative. And we want to create a tool that makes it as easy as possible to evaluate those integration initiatives at a basic level. Are they actually effective at promoting integration and reducing segregation of students? And then finally, one of the motivations is simply to take public data that's out there on student enrollment by race, by grade, over time, and make it easily accessible and easy to look up the enrollment of a school or a district or a state and look at, in particular, demographic trends over time. And so this is a first attempt to do that. I'm going to switch now to the actual app, which is live. You're obviously also welcome to play around with it yourself. These are essentially my slides in case everything breaks in the app and I need to go back to slides. But if I switch over to the app, Integrate USA, which we can see here, really leads with maps. So this is one change from Integrate NY, but we kind of center maps because so much of the segregation that exists is geographically based. And what we're looking at is a map of the United States where we see 90,000 plus points for each school in the United States. And we're looking at the color based on the most common race or the prevalent race in the school of the major racial categories: white, Hispanic, Black, or Asian, as well as the smallest sort of a collected other races, including two or more races included in that. And we can, by clicking on the upper right, search for any district we want to. Obviously, in this current setting, looking for the New York City Public Schools would be interesting. And we can zoom in on a map of New York City where we see the district and can look at information in the district. For example, 1,862 schools. with 968,233 students. We can see the racial breakdown. We can look at geographic patterns of segregation and filter on or hover over different schools to see the proportion of students in those schools in a pie chart. If we click on a district, we can look at both demographic information, which we find at the top of the web page, or segregation for that district. And so if we look at New York City, the tool will take us to a page that loads data specific to New York City. And so we have some basic summary statistics at the top. As I mentioned, 1,862 schools, including charter schools. So by default, all charter schools are included and mapped to their geographic district. So we're getting a comprehensive picture of segregation between district and charter schools. Private schools are not included. We can look at the breakdown of students into the major racial categories and begin to get a sense of the segregation in the district, because what we're looking at here is essentially a really large bar chart. And it's a bar chart with 1,862 rows. In the case of New York City, it looks very different in most districts that are much smaller. We can zoom in and see some of the individual bars and individual schools. And we can zoom out to get a holistic picture of the entire district and the racial makeup of students in the entire district. If we want to sort by percent Asian, we can click on percent Asian and see the distribution of Asian students in schools across the city. We can look at the distribution of Black students in schools across the city. And I think one of the reasons it's particularly interesting to look at New York is there has been a narrative that at least I've heard a bit over the last, 5+ years, that New York City is the most segregated school district in the country. And so that's one use case for this dashboard, is we can begin to answer that question. If we look, for example, at a few recent, newspaper quotes, we'll see sometimes, like this example from Chalkbeat at the top, the claim that New York City's public school system is the most segregated in the country. Sometimes we see more qualified statements, like in the New York Times a couple of years ago, New York City is home to one of the most segregated school systems in America. So one question we want to look at using data from Integrate USA is that true? Is New York City the most segregated school district in the country? Is it one of the most segregated school districts in the country? The way we measure segregation on the dashboard, which you'll see a version on the dashboard that looks just like this chart, is slightly different than we do on Integrate NY, but ultimately very correlated. And it's using a measure that's sometimes called the Normalized Exposure Index. And so we look in New York City at what is the racial makeup of students in the typical Asian student school. On average, Asian students go to school with 38.8% other Asian students, 10.3% Black students, 28.9% Hispanic students, and so on. In the typical Black student school, et cetera. And so if we're looking at the typical, let's say, segregation of Black students, the typical Black student in New York attends a school that's 48.1% Black. We can see that right here. The typical non-Black student attends a school that's 16.4% Black. And the difference between those two numbers, 31.7, is a measure of segregation of Black students called the Normalized Exposure Index. And it ranges from 0 to 100. If these two numbers are identical, the percent Black students in the typical Black student school and percent Black students in the typical non-Black student school, you'd get 0. If there is complete segregation, you'd get 100. And one of the reasons we switched to these measures is not only is it fairly easy to explain and intuitive, but it also has the nice property that it ranges from 0 to 100 in a very consistent way. No matter the district, if there's perfect segregation, it will be 100. If there's no segregation, it will be 0. And segregation defined as a totally even distribution of students across schools. If we take New York City's number, 31.7, we can compare it to other districts. And so what we see here is that New York City is more segregated than most school districts, but not the most segregated. So we're looking here at the Black Normalized Exposure Index in 22-23 for all grades, and New York City is 9th on the list among relatively large, relatively diverse school districts. So we're not looking at all 13,000 school districts here. We're looking at the 106 school districts that have at least 50 students, 10% Black, 10% or more Black, 10% or more Hispanic, and at least 10% white. So they're relatively diverse in terms of some of the major racial groups. New York City, we see, is relatively segregated, but there are school districts like Chicago, Fulton and DeKalb County, DC, and Philadelphia that, at least on this measure for Black students, show up as more segregated. I see that there's a question in the text about how the typical student is determined. That's a great question. That's kind of shorthand. Really, what's meant by that is if you take an average of the racial makeup of all of the students. So essentially saying for the average student, so you take all, let's say there's 100,000 Asian students in New York City, what you average all of their experiences. They each have a racial makeup of their school, every single one. You can look at it, and you take an average of all of the racial makeups of each of their schools. So it's an average, or a weighted average would be a better way to describe it. So New York City is the 9th most segregated district by this particular measure for Black students. We can also look for other racial groups, and we see that New York City is, again, one of the most segregated districts. It is the 2nd most segregated for Asian students, 11th for Hispanic students, 18th for white students. And if you combine Black and Hispanic students and compare it to Asian and white students, it's the 6th most segregated district. So definitely very segregated, not maybe the most segregated. We can look at other integration measures, the segregation index, which is on Integrate NY, the dissimilarity index, which is another common integration measure, or TILES H, which researchers often use, and we see very similar results. Again, New York City is one of the most segregated districts. Now, it's interesting to look at who the most segregated districts are along all of these measures, and Chicago shows up quite frequently. So for Black students and for Hispanic students, as well as on some measures for Asian students or others, Chicago shows up as the most segregated school district. And for Asian students, St. Paul, Minnesota shows up. So we were curious about these results and wanted to look at what segregation looks like in Chicago. And so the tool makes it easy to do that. So if we look up Chicago and pick the right Chicago, City of Chicago School District 299, we can look at the same picture for Chicago. And this is the distribution of students by school in Chicago. We see that many schools either have a very low proportion of Black students. Again, Black students are blue in this graph, or a very high proportion of Black students. So there is, very substantial segregation of Black students. And if we go back to the map on the homepage, we can zoom into Chicago and see what that segregation looks like. Again, we're looking here just at the district itself, not the surrounding area, which we could do if we picked the county level. And we can see there are areas like the south side of Chicago where if we hover over schools, they're essentially close to 100% Black students, and other areas that are close to 0% Black students, sometimes quite nearby. If we go to the segregation page, we'll see again what those statistics look like for Chicago. And we can see that the typical Black student attends a school that looks very different in terms of its racial makeup than the typical, or average, shall we say, and by average I do mean mean, which was a question that came up in the chat, the average student of other races. We also see, going back over time, this number for Chicago tends to be quite high, And if we look down at the bottom, we can actually see the same data for all school districts. So down at the bottom here, we have a table with all roughly 13,000 school districts showing the Black normalized exposure. We can limit this, and this is one of the powerful features of the tool, is it makes it easy to limit this to just districts with, say, over 50 students, just 10% or more Black, 10% or more Hispanic, 10% or more white. And we've now limited ourselves to 106 districts, which are the districts I was showing in the chart. We can download this data using this button. So you'll see most of the charts have a download data where you can download data into Excel. If you remove all the filters, you can easily just download the entire data set. St. Paul was another interesting district. And so we can look at St. Paul public schools. And here was a case where it was most interesting, or it may be most interesting, to look at Asian students, because we saw that St. Paul was scoring as the most segregated district for Asian students. So I've switched this to look at the typical or average Asian student in St. Paul public schools who attends a school that is 60.8% Asian. And when we look down at the trend, we see a pretty notable increase in this number over time. And to get a sense of how notable this is, we can filter for districts that are potentially somewhat similar. So I'm going to add a filter in addition to the 106 schools here, schools that have at least 10% Asian, which filters down to 21 school districts, and we can add them to the map. So if we click individual school districts like New York City, we can add those to the map. Or if we click this button, we can add all school districts to the map. And we see that most school districts have had a fairly consistent number as far as Asian segregation, though there have been some increasing. It looks like Wake County Schools here has been going up as well. New York City, which used to have much higher Asian segregation than St. Paul, now has substantially lower Asian segregation. I didn't know a lot about St. Paul, so I Googled this because I was curious. And, fairly quickly, we can see articles like the article here that highlights one potential cause. Remember, we are including charter schools in this analysis. And this article from a couple of years ago was highlighting how St. Paul has a number of very racially identifiable charter schools. And as we see here, when St. Paul students leave the district, the schools they choose vary dramatically by race. This pattern is especially clear at charter schools, which are exempt from Minnesota's desegregation law. The state, interestingly, has a desegregation law in place. When Asian students, who constitute the largest demographic group in St. Paul public schools, leave the district, they overwhelmingly choose charter schools that primarily serve Asian students. And I just find it interesting that sort of statistic that's spoken about anecdotally in this article, we can see very clearly in the segregation data over time looking at St. Paul. So I want to turn this over to Theo, who's going to take a few minutes to walk through the technology behind what we did. And then we definitely want to open it up for comments, questions, suggestions from everyone here.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. And as you noted, we definitely want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So I might go a little bit quickly through these next few slides. Hopefully, if anything comes up, we have the time to address it at the end. So before we get into the nitty gritty of the technical processes that we ran through to develop the application, I want to sort of frame Integrate USA's development as a response to some things we learned in working on Integrate NY. The first limitation or area that we wanted to really expand on from Integrate NY was that Integrate NY is restricted to one state, and that includes our focus districts and our comparison districts. This wasn't really a surprise to us. After all, it's in the name, but we wanted to, as Jesse has touched on, throughout this presentation, really expand the scope, apply the ideas and analysis behind Integrate NY to a national data set so that we can allow users to contextualize what they're looking at and find districts that make sense as a comparison, whether or not it's within the confines of a particular state. The second limitation that we wanted to address for Integrate NY is that our segregation metric is a little bit challenging to explain. and the scale can be somewhat variable based on the number of groups measured. In order to sort of address that in Integrate USA, we switched to a more intuitive measure, which Jesse has talked about, called the Normalized Exposure Index, and one that has a consistent scale of 0 to 100, and it's just a little bit easier, at least to us, to wrap your head around when you're trying to understand how it's actually measuring segregation. The third limitation of Integrate NY that we wanted to address was that our visualization platform, we use Tableau, provides really great out-of-the-box functionality, but it limited our flexibility. And that's not to say that Tableau doesn't provide an array of really great visualizations, really great services, but we felt that in developing a tool, we wanted to give ourselves maximum flexibility. We didn't want to feel constrained by what a third-party software did or did not provide. So to that end, we decided to develop a web application with open source software. The sky was really the limit for us, but there were some bumps along the way that I think I'll talk about in these next few slides. So when we were approaching the development of our application, we really had three larger workflows, thinking about our backend, which is our data, how our data is structured in our database, our front end, which is what you see when you navigate to the site, and our server, which is really the infrastructure that makes sure when you visit integrateusa.org that you see what we want you to see. So our backend and front end processes were really sort of parallel in the way that we approach them. In both instances, we started with our vision. With the backend, it was sort of understanding our data model, how our tables really, how we were going to organize all the data that we had and how our tables relate to one another. And on the front end, it was really a case of understanding our visualizations. So in some cases, we literally sketched out on pieces of paper our key features and functionality that we wanted to see. And the application has gone through a lot of changes. I think there's a lot of ways that it's become nicer over the course of the development process. But what you see when you visit the site is really very aligned with the vision that we had when we started out this process. For both the backend and the front end, we chose our frameworks. For the backend, we used a service called Django, which is a web development framework for Python. And for our front end, we used a service called Next.js, which is built on a language called React.js. And we chose both of those based on sort of their popularity, the robustness of their documentation. Neither Jesse or I are web developers by trade. We are both from a more of an analytic background. So we wanted to make sure that we felt supported in working through problems that we knew would inevitably arise. For our backend, one of our key steps after we had sort of understood our goal and chosen our tools was to set up our APIs. So essentially a way for our front end and back end to talk to each other and to get the data that is so key to our visualizations and our application. For our front end, we researched and implemented a lot of libraries. A lot of the things that you see when you visit the site are really cool services that have been built, things like Mapbox for the mapping, Chart.js for a lot of our charts. And so we're really reliant on a lot of different tools to make the site go. In standing up our server, this was really the part of the process that was the biggest learning curve for us. I think it's probably still the biggest learning curve, and it will is something that will be informed, we hope, by user testing and understanding sort of some of the how well the site is functioning, is or isn't functioning, so that we can improve it. We use a service called Nginx that pretty much just accepts our client requests and makes sure that we are serving up the right views when somebody navigates to our site. And something that we'll have to do in future as we go live with the site is really optimize our server, make sure that as we get more traffic, everything still works efficiently. So the next slide is, there's been a lot of services mentioned in that slide, and I just want to give a little bit of an overview of how everything sort of fits together when you visit the site. So when you type in integrateusa.org into your browser after this presentation, or maybe some of you have the site up right now, which would be great, and you navigate to the info page, what you'll see is something like what Jesse demoed in the site. Maybe you'll see for New York City, the data for all grades in this 22-23 school year. And what's happening in that process is that front end, what you're seeing is rendered by Next.js, and then Nginx serves that web page to your browser. So once you've sort of interacted, you've seen that, maybe you've interacted with our visualizations, gotten some great insights, and downloaded a ton of data, and now maybe you're interested in looking at Los Angeles Unified. So what you would do when you type in Los Angeles Unified and select that district, what you're essentially doing is changing your query parameters. Now you're feeding those parameters to our backend, which is built using Django, to our API, and saying that instead of looking at New York City all grades data for 22-23, now I want to see Los Angeles Unified all grades data for 22-23. So our backend goes and talks to our database, executes that query, returns the data, and Next.js renders the data, and Nginx serves that web page back to your browser. So that's essentially what's happening, a very high level and a very quick overview of what's happening when you actually navigate to our site and how our architecture is sort of set up. So this was a pretty big learning curve for us, as I mentioned. Neither Jesse or I comes from a web development background, but we really wanted to aim high with this and learn a lot. And hopefully we hope that we've delivered something that's really useful and intuitive. In each sort of work stream, I think that we learned a lot over the course of this process. For the front end, I think it's fair to say that Next.js was the right choice for our project. And sort of a subpoint of that is that working in React enabled us to create a really dynamic application. We hope that we have a pretty fluid user interface, and we hope that it's pretty clear how things fit together. Although, of course, that'll change when we get more feedback and make improvements. Our big challenge was really thinking in React. As I mentioned, we are both sort of more accustomed to data analytics. So writing R and Python code for data analysis is a very different paradigm than what we were adjusting to writing React front-end code. So that was a really big change for us in our workflows. Our future goals here are to add additional visualizations to the segregation page and to produce new research using Integrate USA. There's already some research on the site that I think Jesse will mention, but we want to push that forward. For our backend, we felt that we had a really strong foundation for a well-designed and robust data model. Our pipeline is robust. The 22-23 NCS data was released a few weeks ago, and updating the site was pretty seamless. And a lot of the documentation and resources that we had to rely on made the process pretty smooth. In the future, we want to, continue to refine our processes, make them as smooth as possible. There are some things that are still a little bit manual that we can always improve. And I think a big goal is to create comprehensive documentation for our API in case people are interested in accessing our data that way. As I mentioned, our server is still one of our biggest areas for growth, for learning. Configuring our server was the biggest challenge. And I think as more people visit the site, we need to understand how to optimize and use our resources efficiently. So our future goals there are sort of to collect feedback from our users and make sure that we are, continuing to push ourselves, continuing to research and learn how to make the site run as effectively as possible. So I think that's what I had, and I think Jesse will cap it off.
Sounds great. Just want to, close this out with highlighting a few resources. The most obvious is the site, which is live and you can look at. There is data for most charts that can be downloaded in Excel, so you can do your own research or analysis, including some pretty large data sets. And then we're going to have a shared folder where we're going to put this presentation, and to the extent we can, we'll start putting other resources or making publicly available GitHub with code that we think might be relevant for others. Our next steps, one of the big ones is to beta test Integrate USA. So the site is not perfect now in various ways. And so would love help in identifying issues, questions, or ways to improve the site. We want to do additional research with the data or facilitate research by others. And then a little bit longer term, we want to think about adding state data. And state data would allow us to both have more up-to-date data. For example, New York State has come out with their enrollment data already. The federal government won't have it till January of next year, for the current year. So it'll be more current and add in other data like test scores or other data that might be relevant that really is much better at the state level. Our ask for the folks here on this Zoom is, first of all, beta testing. Can you help us out? What's working well? What problems do you see? I'll give you an example of a problem that we discovered fairly recently. As Theo said, updating data for the last school year was pretty smooth and went well, though recently we learned Los Angeles didn't report race data, or did report race data that the federal government decided not to report because they felt it was unreliable. So if you go to Los Angeles right now for Integrate USA, all you're going to see are charter schools. And so, we've got a short-term and a long-term fix. The short-term fix is we put up notes explaining why and explaining that we're only including schools that have race data reported. The long-term fix is we probably need to include, a not reported category, which historically over the last 20 years has been very, very small, almost negligible. But when Los Angeles doesn't report, it's far from negligible. And the second request is, for whom might this resource be useful? If you think there are people who would benefit from this, we'd love to be put in touch with them, or send this on to them, because we'd like to get this in as many hands as possible, especially as we improve it. So the first is kind of important for the second, because we want to really make sure we've got everything as correct and useful as it can be as we try to publicize this more widely. And you can certainly email me with any suggestions, questions, or referrals. So with that, I will really say thank you so much, and would love to turn it over to questions, a few of which or many of which are in the chat. We've been trying to answer some as we go, but I'm sure we have missed others. And so want to just open the floor to anybody who'd like to either ask a question or make a comment for the group. I will, in the meantime, if nobody raised their hands, look at a few of these questions. There's one saying, looking at Manhattan on this map, can't help but think how much is obscured by lack of reporting on private schools. I think that is very relevant. I think it's particularly relevant in New York, where up to 20% or more of students attend private schools. And so, we are certainly missing private schools. With that said, some of the policy action is with public schools. It is, first of all, easiest to do things, and not at all easy. I think folks from WXYZ will tell us this. It's quite the opposite of easy, but easier to do public school integration within a district than it is to do public school integration across districts, and even harder would be, private schools as well. But I agree with that perspective on the importance of private schools. DeFritas has a question.
Hi, yeah, I put it in the chat, but I thought I'd just say it. I was just really curious about the indexes, the segregation indexes, and been reading a lot about them recently. And there just seems to be so many slightly different, nuanced, and a lot of competition, and arguments about which ones are the best. And I'm trying to make my way through it with a mathematics background, but it's still, these are economists who write these papers. And so, if you could give a little more information about why you switched from one to another. I know they probably all have some limitations, but I'm really curious about how these particular mathematical models might be shaping the data in particular ways.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, some of it is based on mathematics, but some of it's not. Some of it is about having something that is more common sense, understandable. We found that working with New York State that they had a preference for something that was relatively easy to understand, maybe highly correlated with Piles H, but that you could say, okay, that's how you calculate it, and it's not using natural logarithms, and we understand it. And in some of the research that I put in the chat, we look at the correlation of a lot of these measures, and we found the measure in New York State that we developed to be simple, highly correlated with other measures. And when we looked at actual examples where they were misaligned, like we'd look at the actual schools and see how they're segregated, we said, oh, we actually like this one better. Its behavior in actual examples seemed more reasonable to policymakers. As to why we switched, that was for a couple of reasons. One, we talked to Sean Reardon at Stanford, and he and Laura Owens were coming out, Ann Owens were coming out with the segregation index project at USC. They were using the normalized exposure index, and we ended up finding it a pretty compelling and simple measure that we felt might be worth switching to. And what ultimately tipped the balance for us between the measure we use in Integrate NY and Integrate USA is the consistent scale issue, that the normalized exposure index goes from 0 to 100. 0 means all schools are even. 100 means perfect segregation. Now, there are other measures that do that, like the dissimilarity index. But we felt the normalized exposure index did that in a really useful way, in a really intuitive way, and that the measure we used on Integrate NY didn't. If there are just two groups, it caps out at 50. If there are multiple groups, which of course for races there are, it actually can cap out at a lower number. So that was a concern we had with the segregation index and why we decided to make the choice. Another debate we've had is, should we just put them all up? We have them all calculated. We could, without too much difficulty, just have all of them and you choose your own adventure on the site. Be curious what folks think of that. Should we use the same data and just put up all the different indices so you can pick and choose the one you want, or should we lead with one? We ended up choosing for simplicity and only having one on the site now, though we have 5 or 6 different ones calculated.
Thank you.
Maybe time for one more question or comment. Jose Pimentel Cardoso.
Hi, thank you. And I'm sorry if this is maybe outside of the scope of this project because it's, analyzing school districts, but I wonder if, as a piece of advice, you'd have any information on resources and kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty of particular schools, particular programs, because here in New York City, there are a lot of high schools specifically that have different programs within those high schools. For example, the high school I went to had 2 gifted programs and 1 zoned program, which pulled kids from the neighborhood that we were in, which was Flatbush. And that's the reason that I selected to go there when I was, 13 or whatever, is because I thought the school was going to be racially diverse. But turned out there was segregation within the school programs. The gifted programs were majority white, and the zone programs were where, children of ethnic minorities were found. And, I guess, I'm asking if there's any way that, just the average constituent would be able to look into the data of a particular school and figure that out for themselves.
So the short answer is no, there isn't right now. We've done a fair bit of research on within school segregation, and New York City, we've actually done it with statewide data that the state provided us, New York State Education Department, and then we've done it with city data that the cities provided. And there are G&T programs, there are language-specific programs, dual language programs that can create a lot of within school segregation. That has been kind of a goal. Would there be some way to add that data to an open data source? But right now, it's not something that exists in an open data framework, something that you could just look into. I could imagine a world where either the results of a within school segregation could be publicly available, or even the raw data. Massachusetts, for example, has data on all students publicly available if you email them to request it. You email, you get a form back, and it's de-identified, so you can't identify the student, but would allow you to do some types of, within school segregation calculation. So I think that's a really interesting idea. It's a very real phenomenon, but it's not something that is very easy with open data. Audrey, did you want to close us out? Sorry for running slightly over.